So there are some areas where Australia may just be leading the way in the circular economy. We're coming to you from the driest state in the driest continent on Earth. So managing our water resources in a circular manner has been something that we've been doing for quite some time here. Catherine Billette from South Australia's Environment Protection Authority will talk to you about our 30-year history of really reworking and getting the most value out of water here in the greater Adelaide metropolitan area. So tell us more about South Australia's journey to managing water in a way that makes it really valuable.
Okay, so the first thing to understand about South Australia is that we've got a rainfall, well, Greater Adelaide in particular, because the range of rainfall is quite variable throughout the state. But in terms of focusing on Greater Adelaide, which is where the main population base is, we have a rainfall of an average of 550 mil per year, and it's mainly falls around winter. With climate change, winter, spring, autumn, winter, spring, we have the odd summer rainfall, but that sort of comes in a burst and it's difficult to capture. And with climate change, we're getting lesser rainfall and over time, and particularly lesser spring rainfall. So that top up after winter of the reservoirs is not happening as well.
So we're already concretely seeing the climate change shift here in South Australia?
We are seeing a small amount of change, but it's really the predicted change that's the issue. The small amount of change we've seen so far is manageable, but it's the predicted change that is an issue. It really started to come to a head about 30 years ago, where we had irrigators both north and south of the city. So we had McLaren Vale and Wollonga Basin in the south and Northern Adelaide Plains in the north, where it became apparent that the groundwater use was becoming unsustainable. And it really was heightened in the Northern Adelaide Plains, so the Virginia horticulture region, where they had a cone of depression of their groundwater, and that was happening and being monitored at the same time as nationally and statewide the National Water Initiative was being thought of. And just a twinkle in people's eyes, but sustainable water use and water allocation was becoming more of an issue in terms of policymakers' minds, and this is sort of at the late 80s, at the same time as irrigators were realising that, particularly in the Northern Adelaide Plains, that it was becoming unsustainable because they were having to go down deeper to pump. They were having to put more effort into pumping that water, and so at the same time as they were realising that the groundwater use was unsustainable, we had a couple of other things happening at the same time. So we had a realisation from a marine biologist in SA Water, so the old ENWS department, was gathering evidence to show that the sludge outfall and the treated wastewater outfall coming off the Adelaide Metro coasts was degrading the seagrass meadows. Mm-hmm. So that was another thing. So there was a call to remove that, particularly the sludge and also the treated wastewater from the seagrass meadows. At the same time as there was a need to replace the groundwater in the Northern Adelaide Plains.
So we've got wastewater with nutrients that are polluting the marine environment at the same time that we have farmers, horticulturals, vineyards that are needing more water.
Needing an irrigation source. So, and it was removed nutrients and removed suspended solids as well, because they're both an issue. So then at the same time we had which is not wastewater related, but stormwater related, which was also producing nutrients and suspended solids, or sending it out to sea. We had a Northern Region Council, Salisbury Council, who was becoming quite entrepreneurial and saying, well, we've got a really dry area, we've got a relatively low socioeconomic area. We would like to actually capture that stormwater, create wetlands so that we've got nice ambient places for people to walk around, and then irrigate our dry areas in summer with that treated stormwater. So there was also a push parallel to this, and completely separate from this at that stage, to reuse stormwater for irrigation in suburbs, in the urban area. So putting the stormwater sort of aside, there was sort of realisation in sort of higher levels of government that we needed to actually maybe bring these two together in terms of the need for water in Northern Adelaide Plains and the Bolivar and Glenelg in particular wastewater treatment plants, needing to do something about those. So we put in a multi-agency working group to try to see if we can sort out some sort of combined solution.
So it's multi-agency at the state level, and that's also bringing together council, what would have been the ENWS at that stage.
Yep, so
as
the
well?
ENWS, so it was multi-agency, so let's say the sort of stormwater issues going along parallel, so that was separate. So it was multi-agency, so it was SA, it was ENWS, it was planning, so I was involved in planning at the time, so it was environmental impact assessment. It was Woods and Forests, because at that stage... Woods and Forests, it's no longer a department, but it was.
And remind us what ENWS stands for again.
Engineering and Water Supply Department. Okay, so they're basically the old SA Water. So the SA Water is now ENWS. So it was Woods and Forests because they thought that maybe we could do a hardwood irrigated afforestation trial,
Nice.
which we did. So, and also the Department of Ag, it was now Primary Industries SA, Department of Ag had an irrigation specialist. So an irrigation engineer basically, and also in Department of Ag we had soil specialists because we've got a fairly high salt content.
So there was a real interlinking of different specialisations.
There was, and so that was, and that enabled all sorts of considerations to be considered. We have a geographer in terms of land use planning. We had me as a biologist sort of translating the marine biology
and
stuff
where were you
into
at
policy.
That stage?
I was in what was called Environment Planning Department in land use planning. So I was a biologist in land use planning looking at environmental impacts of development proposals.
Fantastic. So what happened next?
So we basically collectively wrote this report to say we should give it a go. We should try land-based disposal. So the report was called, Land-Based Disposal of Bolivar Effluent Water or something. And we sought funding, and we got funding, and we did the trial of a hardwood afforestation trial, so blue gums, I think from memory, and we also did some trialling out in Virginia.
Okay, when was that?
Area. That was late 80s, early
late
90s. Late 80s. So the report was, I think the report came out 1990 or something, and so it was early 90s. And in 1993, the sludge outfall stopped. Okay, so we had enough impetus to stop the sludge outfall.
Fantastic.
Treated wastewater went to tertiary treatment as opposed to secondary. Sorry, it went to secondary treatment. We want tertiary treatment, we've not got that. So secondary treatment, so it removed pathogens and everything, but we still had the nutrients and suspended solids. Then...
the nutrients which are now useful because they're going onto farming.
Yes.
Great.
But the salt's not useful. So then what happened was we did the trial, and then at the late 1990s, I think it was, we started to put all the infrastructure and pipelines and everything in place to actually start doing land-based disposal in the Northern Adelaide Plains from Bolivar and Glenelg treatment plants, because Glenelg gets sent to Bolivar. And then about a year later, I think it was McLaren Vale, Christie's Beach wastewater treatment plant was put into McLaren Vale, Wollonga. And in the meantime, McLaren Vale, Wollonga, we did a water allocation plan for them, and that was under the Water Resources Act 1997. When did we do that? We did that. We had the water allocation plan prepared by about 2000 for McLaren Vale, Wollonga. They didn't have a cone of depression. The idea there was that we prevented them from getting to that stage.
Okay.
So it was preventative, sustainable irrigation there, and so a year later, and there was a private company. So the first one was government sort of supported and initiated. The Christie's Beach, while that was all happening, there was a private company, the Wollonga Basin Water Company, actually did the same thing and set up the same thing in conjunction with SA Water for the Christie's Beach wastewater treatment plant out of Wollonga.
Okay, so water that was polluting is now being used to generate new industry and to make it so that the industries that is there can continue to prosper.
That's right.
Are there any perverse outcomes in terms of people being encouraged to use more water so that you've got more water to go to industry, or has water use dropped at the same time?
Groundwater use has dropped in both, because in the meantime there was water allocation plans for groundwater in both north and south, so that put a limit on groundwater use, so that's now being managed sustainably. In terms of other water, with more water available, we've actually had growth in the spatial distribution of those industries. Okay, so we've got more grape growing has extended, and out north, both grape growing in Barossa and also extension of the horticultural capacity has extended. Okay. So it's extended.
So more food, more wine, that's good.
More food, more wine, and we're now up to 33% land-based disposal of the treated wastewater, which is quite high, and we're expecting another 12 gigalitres, and I don't know what that is percentage-wise, to be going out to the Northern Adelaide Plains over the next few years, so that's planned. And even just that extension of 12 gigalitres, and like I said, I wouldn't hazard a guess as to what percentage that is, but probably 5% more or something. I think and I do need to check this number because it's in my paper. It's in the paper, so we can check. Everybody can check my memory. I think it's about 570 million in terms of regional benefit.
Dollars, that's amazing.
Dollars, just through this extra bit that's happening out at Northern Adelaide Plains. And part of that is because they're looking to do value-added, high-quality export horticulture.
Okay.
As opposed to what I talked about in my talk was with the advantage of having food and wine on the fringes, low food miles, and the whole sustainability thing about having fresh food in terms of health benefits and low food miles in terms of sustainability coming out of Virginia. However, this particular bit is to chase the dollar, the export dollar, so it won't be low food miles, but it'll be in terms of the state coffers.
So far we've been talking about the water coming out of the system and reusing that in a more intelligent way, developing the economy around the use of that water, that it's not just the megalitres, but it's the nutrients in the water as well that are now being used at a higher value. What about the upstream sort of planning and protection of our basins side of things?
Okay, so remind me, I've got to talk about the disablers, which is the salt and a couple of other things, but one of the major enablers of all of this is the security of supply. Okay, so we're talking about security supply of land through the zoning that we've got, because we've also got, we've put an urban boundary in through the last 30 years as well. So about...
What do you mean by urban boundary?
Okay, so urban boundary means that because Adelaide is a very sprawling city, we're 90 kilometres between north and south, quite sort of long and narrow because we have the Adelaide Hills to the east and we have the sea to the west. We've extended lengthwise, and we've extended a part of the best agricultural land in this region we've already built on, but we still have had the north and the south at the fringes, what I've been talking about, McLaren Vale, Northern Adelaide Plains, Barossa. We've made a conscious decision in terms of strategic planning in this state not to continue to extend out into those areas, partly because of the value of those areas for agriculture. When that was all, and partly because we wanted to have economies of scale of infrastructure provision within the urban boundary, because we've got a low density city. So if you're trying to provide transport infrastructure, hospital social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, electricity, poles and wires and transport or whatever, and public transport, that the more you spread that, the less efficient services you can provide people. And there's a whole lot of issues
associated with that.
limiting
sprawl and protecting.
Limiting sprawl, protecting
land.
and having efficient infrastructure. It was also about protecting land, but what wasn't thought about at the time was protecting the security of supply of that land in terms of the integration between water use planning and land use planning. So what wasn't thought about at the time was that it's also a major benefit because we can do land-based disposal of that water and get it out of the sea and all the benefits that we get from that. And also wasn't thought about at the time was that it's a climate-independent source of water, because climate change wasn't thought of at the time when the urban boundary was being talked about. So the urban boundary was put in place in terms of zoning provisions in the late 90s. Even though climate change was on the agenda, it wasn't necessarily at top of mind with urban planning and infrastructure development. But then we did an upgrade of the strategic plan for Greater Adelaide, and that incorporated climate change, incorporated integration of water use planning with land use planning. So we had the treated wastewater. We talked about the importance of having that area for land-based disposal of treated effluent and all of the integrated benefits that you get from from having that urban boundary in terms of, having sustainable communities, because we've got communities that have not only got security supply of land, but security supply of water for irrigation, and therefore, the regional sustainability of those communities as well.
So what have been the keys to success of this story?
Multiple benefits. Okay, so multiple benefits that are integrated.
So it's win-win for everyone.
Win-win for everybody. The fact that we've got multi-agency planning working together, we've got multi-level of government working together, and we've got private, and in terms of since then integrating with stormwater. The bit that we're not doing well enough at the moment is integrating all of the alternative water uses together in a whole of water cycle plan. We're getting there, we've got bits and pieces, but we've not done it as well as we could have. So that's an area for improvement. So we've got public and private sector working together in terms of Wollonga Basin plus, plus irrigators, plus SA Water, and the same out north now. It's very important to have that land use planning. The urban boundary there is really the hidden Cinderella here, is that people don't sort of necessarily link the land use planning and the water use planning together. And price. Okay, so price of the treated wastewater is much less than alternative water sources, north and south.
Okay.
And this is where the integration of the stormwater comes in, because the price of the stormwater to reuse it is, the stormwater still has quite a high price. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that.
Oh, so stormwater reuse is more expensive than the...
Yes, the treated wastewater reuse. Not in terms of the pipe, but in terms of the cost of the product.
Okay.
The issue there is where the major disabler we have at the moment is that the treated wastewater has a high salt content. It would be ideal to shandy that with the stormwater, but that's not tending to happen at the moment because of the high price of the stormwater. So what's tending to happen at the moment, with the extension of the Northern Adelaide scheme that I've just referred to, they're talking about using individual desal plants to get rid of the salt instead of shandying it with the stormwater.
So it's cheaper to desal than to mix, in some cases?
It's cheaper if we don't value things properly. Okay, so at the moment, in terms of the pricing regime that's in at the moment, it's cheaper. It's appearing cheaper. However, that's because I don't think we have costed everything properly, including costing the salt and regulating the salt. We regulate outfalls. We're not regulating the salt that goes onto the land. Okay, as an EPA, for instance.
Yep.
And we're regulating treated wastewater. We're not regulating stormwater. And so that has an impact on the price differential between treated wastewater and stormwater. So the pricing mechanisms are all quite complex, and I don't believe we've sorted out the pricing mechanisms properly and the regulation of the salt properly.
So there's still some technical issues around salt, some regulatory challenges, some pricing challenges, but globally it's a pretty amazing story as to what can be done when you really value a resource, when you're really in need for something. You can get creative and work together.
That's right, and we can solve the other issues. It depends on, are we solving them to the best value of the water sources that we've got, and are we solving them to the highest value in terms of what do we do about the bits that we don't want, the salt. So we haven't worked that bit out.
And would you have any advice to other cities that might be looking into the future of how they might need to better manage their water in a more circular way?
I think look at your whole of water cycle. Look at it in an integrated way in terms of what your water sources are, and make sure that you get buy-in from your water users and your water suppliers very early on in the conversation. We had early buy-in with irrigators north and south in terms of acceptability of reusing that treated wastewater. And also there's the issue of the social acceptability of using treated wastewater, recycling water and stormwater as well. So I think have those early conversations with suppliers and users, and also it's absolutely vital that the different players in terms of water authorities and levels of governance and regulators all talk very early on to see how they can work in together as well.
Fantastic. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Only that there's one little white elephant that we've got in closing up the loop in South Australia at the moment. It was originally, all of this originally was driven by supply, the need for
More water.
additional fresh water. We now have, actually there's a couple of things. We now have a desal plant, and the desal plant provides Adelaide with metropolitan water supply. It doesn't supply irrigators because the cost is too high, so we'll still need this treated wastewater for irrigators, but it does mean that we do have, albeit a high cost supply, if we need it. So we were given, and this comes up to the same Mills, where the second point is, all of the reuse schemes, both stormwater and treated wastewater, were accelerated as a result of the drought. Okay, so we had a little accelerator in here in the middle years. So between 2000 and 2010 we had the millennium drought. We suddenly got heaps of federal funding for stormwater reuse schemes and for additional treated wastewater schemes. So we had one that I haven't mentioned, a Glenelg treated wastewater scheme coming into the urban areas of the city. That was, you know, the chap who was trying to get that off the ground took 20 years trying to get off the ground, but nobody was listening until we had a drought. Okay, so until we had a drought. Sometimes you only get what you wish for in times of crisis, and so that brought in a whole new motivation to actually do both treated wastewater schemes and like I said, urban area schemes mainly. Through the drought. So yes, so sometimes a crisis is a great accelerator, but you have to have your plans ready before the crisis, so that you can put your bids in for the funding and have them ready. So that GAP scheme, Glenelg scheme, had been ready for, you know, at least a decade to go on.
Fantastic. So as soon as the crisis was there, I have your solution.
That's right. So we have what we call the hydrological cycle. You heard of?
No.
A hydrological cycle is that the best time for planning for integrated whole of water cycle approach to water supply and management is when you have water is plentiful, because you can have time to talk about and get all the data that you need and do the research so that you have a solution that's rational. But we tend to only have the money to do that research and have those discussions and have free people's time up to work on that when we have a crisis in a drought. So instead of the hydrological cycle, we call it the hydroillogical cycle.
That's fantastic. So sometimes when you're seeing these kind of knee-jerk reactions in times of crisis, they're actually reactions that have been prepared by very clever people in the background, waiting for that urgency.
So let's just say that and we also had a whole lot of research. So the Gordon Institute for Water Research came out of the drought, so we got both federal and state funding for that as well. But the issue is that we're not going to get more federal funding now to develop further what we've done until we have another drought. Then one of the issues there is that they can say, well, you've got your desal plant, so we don't really care. Your seagrass problem's yours. Your urban irrigation of your suburbs, well, that's sort of really a state issue because your water supply is there. So the next question is, if we, the next drought, because we will have one, are we still going to get federal funding? And that is the big question that we don't know.
Still a few challenges.
Yeah, there's still a few challenges, but we've come a long way. We've just got to work around them.
Fantastic.
And we can.
Well, thanks so much for coming to the Powering the Change to a Circular Economy conference. It's been so great having that 30 years of knowledge in your head that's gone from department to department. It's really precious to be able to get some of that out and share it.
Well, my pleasure.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you.